Brian had just arrived on the UNSC Rite of Passage, an Epic-class heavy carrier in orbit around the planet Coral. With this ship being controlled and outfitted by Oni, it had quite the roster of kills. A carrier, cruiser, destroyer, frigate, and corvette had all taken their final breaths from this heavy carrier's railgun. Yes, Oni equipped a carrier with what can only be described as a railgun. It wasn't equipped with the standard light mag, even having its frame and structure rebuilt to use this railgun. This was Oni's only fully operational prototype, so they didn't exactly parade the ship around the galaxy. It was used in top-secret operations and almost exclusively sat in a defensive position if it was engaged in battle, opting to have its escort of 10 Paris-class heavy frigates, 10 Stalwart-class frigates, and 5 destroyers to create an opening for it to take the final shot. And one shot was all it needed. The interior was quite nice, but wasn't as special as something like the later, greater UNSC Infinity. Brian walked the halls of this ship in his armor and got some looks from people here and there, specifically some ODSTs. He didn't mind it, though, as he was headed straight to the bridge to meet the rear admiral of the ship and battle group. As he entered the bridge, he observed a large room with computers occupied by their respective operators, and the rear admiral talking to one of these operators at the front of the bridge. As Brian walked closer, the rear admiral stopped talking and turned to Brian.
Welcome, Spartan. It's an honor to be here, sir. It's an honor to have a Spartan of your skill set aboard my ship. The name is Rear Admiral Desmond Santiago. It's a pleasure to meet you, sir.
He then gave Brian his mission briefing. Dug out of the side of one of the great mountains on the planet Coral sat an active mining operation being conducted by Oni. This operation was being conducted to uncover an unknown structure that had been discovered beneath the crust of the planet during a routine quarrying by civilians. Brian was to help guard the mining operation if the Covenant were to attack, and Oni had a feeling they would attack, stating if humans could discover the structure by accident, then the Covenant wouldn't be too far behind. Having a Spartan along with their prototype railgun would be their safest bet that this operation would be protected. The miners on the ground were on a need-to-know basis. They weren't allowed to know how many forces or how much equipment Oni had really brought. Brian would be stationed on the ship at all times until the rear admiral said otherwise. Brian would volunteer himself to assist in any activities that the rear admiral would allow to stay busy. This way he could get to know the ship and its crew as best he could. Brian wanted to show the crew off the bat that he isn't some machine like Spartans are typically depicted, but one of them, a human.
All hands to battle stations!
It only took days for Oni to be right. Ugh. That was one of the worst statements I think a human could utter. A small portion of the Covenant fleet of faithful Ardor had discovered Coral and broken through the human defenses that sat at the system's asteroid belt. They were on a full offensive push to wipe out any further human forces occupying Coral itself. The Rite of Passage and half her fleet set up on the far side of Coral, waiting for the Covenant ships to come close enough so the Rite of Passage could take a railgun shot. The other half consisted of all 5 destroyers, 5 Paris-class and 3 Stalwart-class frigates, holding the front line, making the Covenant think that was the last line they had to break through. The front line took out 2 of the 12 CCS-class battlecruisers when they first engaged. However, as soon as they confirmed their kills, the other 10 cruisers and 2 CAS-class assault carriers immediately started punching through, taking out all but 1 destroyer and 3 Paris-class frigates. These last 4 UNSC ships moved to what looked like a retreat to the Covenant, but they were actually linking back up with their rite of passage. Just as the Covenant fleet moved to pursue, 3 of the Covenant cruisers and 1 of the assault carriers were cut through like a knife to butter by the rite of passage's railgun. And the battle for Coral began. 1 Covenant cruiser broke off and made it into atmosphere, while the rest of the ships engaged in battle with the UNSC. Rear Admiral Santiago ordered all ships to open fire and deploy spacecraft and troops. He wasted no time deploying troops to the planet in pursuit of the carrier. Droves of Pelicans were deployed, trying to get 700 troops of Marines to the ground from the rite of passage. The rest of the fleet had their ships deploying troops as well, as escorts, sabers, and longswords were sent out to protect them from the incoming Banshee and Seraph fire. The rite of passage held ODSTs from the 105th Battalion under Oni's secret 77th Shock Troop Division. The Rear Admiral chose to deploy 200 of them off the jump, trying his best to make sure there were enough. An estimated 1,200 troops were to fight against a Covenant ship that held thousands of troops. The Rear Admiral knew that trying to simply go at bare minimum 1-to-1 against the Covenant wasn't going to be enough to fend them off on the ground. So he deployed 1 more unit, Brian G505, to command the troops on the ground while he fought the battle in orbit. Brian was sent with the most elite squad of ODSTs the rite of passage had to offer, Alpha 2. This squad consisted of First Lieutenant James Brenner, Staff Sergeant Arthur McLean, Lance Corporal Kane Riley, and Lance Corporal May Vana. They weren't exactly thrilled that a Spartan was not only commanding them, but also dropping down with them. But Brian didn't mind one bit, and was giving out orders before he even dropped, telling the first wave of soldiers who got to the ground to not only get any unarmed personnel out of the area, but to start establishing fortifications all up and down the quarry. He then told the second and third waves of soldiers to expand out from the quarry and build more fortifications, set up traps, and begin to hold the line. The battlecruiser had originally moved to drop forces directly above the quarry, but ultimately decided to set up shop about 3 miles outside of the quarry due to the heavy UNSC forces descending upon them. Brian would take what little advantage they had and try and build off of that. The cruiser was already deploying troops and Banshees, trying to prevent the UNSC from establishing anything.
Evac transport Delta 1-5 to evac dispatch. Loaded up, ready to go.
That's affirmative.
Brace for a hard landing. Nancy, heads up, Charlie 1. Bitch.
Pull them back! Best you can!
Go, go, go! Fall back for Delta! Fall back! Defensive position!
Instantly, Brian was in the shit and on the front lines. The first wave of Marines were successful in evacuating civilians and unarmed personnel, but they were just barely getting the fortifications set up. Second and third waves were struggling to even hold what ground they had and were even being pushed back. With Brian now on the field, he began to organize the groups. Group up certain Marines and ODSTs to hold the front, while he had sniper groups set up towards the top of the quarry to give overwatch if any Covenant slipped through them. The third wave of soldiers had brought with them machine gun warthogs, but they were scattered about, some even inaccessible due to heavy Covenant fire. Brian commanded all warthogs available to group up in a convoy, and had them running warthog runs up the front line. There were a total of about 20 warthogs in the convoy, with another 10 being inaccessible or beginning to be destroyed. The convoy had a constant rotation, with 10 doing a run in the front, then swapping with the other 10 once they would reach the end of the run and turn back towards safety. This would keep the Covenant forces at bay while they retrieved the rest of the warthogs and gave the first wave of soldiers the time they needed to complete the initial fortifications. Brian would take it upon himself to personally retrieve the missing warthogs and make sure their crew got returned to base. He also kept Alpha 2 within close proximity to him, as he knew they could handle themselves and would be essential in retrieving these missing warthogs. They weren't too fond of this, though, and thought it would be an immediate death sentence, even with a Spartan. Lance Corporal Riley specifically said that they had done some stupid shit, but this idea was worse than a suicide mission. All four ultimately voted to stay on the UNSC side, where it would be safer. Brian sighed and then said,
Here I thought you guys were the best.
and began moving out. As he pushed out of the UNSC fortified zone and into uncharted territory, he was finding injured Marines who needed attention ASAP. Brian made sure each and every one of them got to a medic, even if he had to take heavy fire to do so, opting to carry them across the battlefield and take them to the UNSC side himself in order to see with his own eyes they got to safety. The ODSTs saw this and were in awe of what Brian was doing. At that point, they had no choice but to start respecting Brian and chose to help him in whatever way they could, realizing that in that moment, Brian wasn't being a Spartan, but a fellow soldier. The Covenant began bringing in ghosts to combat the Warthog run, but were unsuccessful due to the convoy focusing fire on each ghost, shredding them apart with ease. Brian made sure that the left and right flanks were covered as well before he went to retrieve the Warthogs. The 200 ODSTs deployed with him, he split as evenly as he could, sending 100 to the left and the rest to the right. The battle felt like they were doing an hour of work for an inch of land, though. The first hour and a half was promising, as the UNSC forces had held on to all they had and had taken very minimal casualties. The second hour was worse, though. The Covenant had been able to deploy elite drop pods from the assault carrier, boosting their ground forces back to full strength. Banshees still plagued the skies with Marines and ODSTs, barely able to take out a few with what weapons they had. To top it all off, Wraiths stationed towards the Covenant's backline started cutting through the convoy and mortaring the middle to back lines of these established UNSC forces. Brian knew that he would have to take on the Wraiths, or else the fight wouldn't last much longer. This is where Brian's signature trait came into play. I call it doing dumb shit and somehow getting results. When he returned to the UNSC side, Brian ordered Alpha 2 to stay and command the front lines while he set his plan into motion. They had retrieved 5 of the 10 missing or destroyed warthogs, and Brian had a separate group of ODSTs loaded up with him, planning to take the fight straight to those wraiths. He knew the risks, and so did the ODSTs. They went out there, full send, with no regrets. Brian had seen that the Covenant's left side, the UNSC's right side, seemed to be the weakest. Brian loaded up with his Spartan laser, while each passenger ODST was equipped with M41 spankers. They were either going to destroy those wraiths, or make absolute hell trying. The 5 Warthog convoy had taken the Covenant forces by surprise. They'd taken out 2 of the 6 Wraiths within minutes, multiple Banshees and ground forces, narrowly avoiding death every second they drove. Brian decided he wanted an early Christmas present, though, and hijacked the 3rd Wraith while the ODSTs moved on to the 4th. We sometimes like to call Brian St. Nick, because he enjoys, and I quote, showering our enemies with gifts, end quote. He would tear apart the Covenant forces from behind and confuse them even further, as they now were fighting on 2 fronts, some thinking their own had turned against them. The ODSTs successfully took out the 4th Wraith, but had lost their head Warthog, with the rest sustaining heavy damage. Knowing they wouldn't last much longer, Brian ordered them back to the UNSC side, and promised he would take care of the rest. Brian then made a call out to Rear Admiral Santiago.
Right of passage. This is Sierra 505. Requesting an immediate ODC drop 1 yard east of my current position. Copy, Spartan. Whatever's left. Affirmative.
Just a moment later, you could hear these loud explosions from above. Bright, glowing lights in the sky, like fireworks being set off. And in the blink of an eye, the ground next to Brian's Wraith was a wall of ODST pods. The Rear Admiral has sent Brian another 100 ODSTs. The 77th Shock Troop Division is home to about 1,000 top-tier and highly classified ODSTs. These soldiers go on missions designated for Spartans. The requirements alone are thought to be impossible for a normal human to achieve. And that's why the 77th is considered an Oni myth, even to this day. They popped out of their pods and started taking out Covenant in all directions. Hell, some of their pods killed Covenant when they hit the ground. Brian ordered an ODST who dropped with an M41 to focus fire and take out the other Wraiths.
Let's give hell, Spartan.
A volley of rockets ended up hitting both Wraiths, and 2 plumes of smoke began filling the air. Brian noticed there weren't any more Covenant coming from the west where the Covenant ship was. So he ordered the ODSTs to start pushing the remaining Covenant forces toward the established UNSC forces in a pinching move. While that was happening, Brian went to work taking out the Banshees left in the sky. He shot down one Banshee, moved to where it had crashed, and hopped out of his Wraith. He proceeded to rip off pieces of the Banshee and use it like a shrapnel shuriken to take down the rest of the Banshees. He didn't need to do this at all. He did it for the, and again, I quote, shits and giggles, end quote. Brian got back into his Wraith and helped clear out the last few Covenant soldiers. Once all the Covenant soldiers were confirmed dead, he immediately went to work, commanding soldiers to build a proper base and expand the fortifications out far enough to defend without being thinned out. The Covenant ship hadn't left yet, which told Brian that they were preparing to send more their way. That was just the first wave, and he knew it would only get worse. Meanwhile, Rear Admiral Santiago was in a fierce battle trying to ensure there wouldn't be any more ships to reach the surface of the planet. The Rite of Passage's railgun takes hours to recharge, so it was all up to the other ships to coordinate and take down as many Covenant ships as they could while the railgun recharged. At this point, the UNSC had taken out 3 more battlecruisers, but the Covenant had dealt an equally devastating blow, taking out the last destroyer, 3 Stalwart-class frigates, and 2 of the 10 Paris heavy-class frigates. Things were looking bleak for both sides. In an insane move, the last 3 battlecruisers were sent on a collision course to take out the UNSC ships that were left while the carrier broke off and headed to the planet. The battlecruisers fought till their last breath and were able to heavily damage the remaining Paris and Stalwart-class frigates. Even managed to get a few hits on the Rite of Passage. The UNSC were successful in destroying the last few battlecruisers, but were majorly crippled from the fight. The Covenant shipmaster took a guess that if the railgun were to fire upon them in atmosphere, they would rip through the planet, causing massive damage. That shipmaster was right, and Rear Admiral Santiago wasn't going to take that risk. The Rear Admiral was going to assist Brian best he could, while repairs were being done on all ships. It was exclusively a ground game now. On the ground, Brian watched as the assault carrier came into atmosphere above the cruiser and docked above it. The overwhelming odds now shifting to impossible odds. Brian thought to do something insane. With plenty of daytime to spare, Brian spoke to the Rear Admiral over secure comms about a plan to bring the fight to the Covenant, a mission to even out the odds and bring the fear of a devil to the remaining Covenant ships.